how do we get to this? What's the big deal about the flood stories? Maybe you got the memo. There are other flood traditions than the Bible. Spoiler alert, they are earlier than the biblical one. Even if you believe that Moses got this verbatim from God himself, and Moses at the earliest is 1400 BC, that's still at the very least a half a millennium later than the earliest evidence of a Mesopotamian flood tradition. So what do you do with that?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Buried Bible Podcast. And just so there's no qualms for this introduction, I'm Keegan Walls. I apparently need a new introduction. I'm the moron. Welcome. And I'm here with the not moron, the doctor himself, Mark Chavalas.
No, today I want to be the layman, so I'm the layman today.
I say it jokingly. If you don't know what we're talking about, kudos.
Yes, good.
So we're on to a new little series, a new topic of discussion, and I will let Mark explain it because he's the doctor, so he'll explain it better. Mark, what are we talking about today?
Well, first I got to talk about my arm. It really hurts right now because it's been twisted just out of proportion. Now it was tough enough doing demons. Now I'm doing the flood story. I figure, no, the flood story has been sort of worked and reworked and overworked, and so how are you going to do it, different than everybody else to make it interesting?
I don't make stuff up.
But that's what I used to tell my classes anyway, and they didn't know any different. So I'm a Mesopotamian scholar, if you haven't already figured it out. So I'm going to be looking at the flood traditions from that standpoint, trying to put the biblical one in context. And so this is how I'm going to operate over 3, 4, or 5 podcasts, however long. It probably depends on how many comments and questions Keegan has in his, all of those irritating interruptions. So that's a quote, by the way, the interruption part. No. So I want to start out by looking at and give an overview of the Mesopotamian traditions, because like everything else from Mesopotamia, they're splintered, they're fragmented, and they're difficult to piece together. And there's certainly no one single Mesopotamian flood tradition, but there are some similarities, of course. So I'll look at them. That'll probably take 1 or 2 podcasts. And my goal, by the way, is really to emphasize the divine deliberation about the flood and their response to it in both the Mesopotamian and in the biblical traditions. I'm not nearly as interested or concerned about the comparative data between them. I'm going to talk about that, but it's sort of been, put it this way, I wrote a term paper about this as an undergraduate in college, and it sort of blew my mind when I started reading the Mesopotamian traditions, in translation, of course, and then looking at the flood story. Wow, this is amazing. And so I wrote a term paper on it. I didn't really get a great grade on it, by the way. It was my history pro seminar paper. And my professor, Earl Field, was really, really nice and gracious in the way he told me that I wasn't the brightest the student in the class. And even before that, I must have been interested in flood traditions because I was taking a geology course as one of those, forced general education courses when I was at San Fernando Valley State College. And I remember the professor was talking about the earth and geology and the age of the earth, etc. And I think I naively raised my hand, as a Bible-believing Christian, and talking about what about the biblical flood? How do you fit that in here? And I had no idea. I really wanted to know. And the professor very nicely said, "That's an actually really interesting topic. Would you care to maybe talk about it in our next class? And I'll give you 15 or 20 minutes to talk about it." And I stupidly said, "Sure." But it actually was really, really fun to do. And of course, I knew nothing about geology. In fact, I know as much about it now as I did back then. But it really got me, trying to figure a lot of this stuff out. But I've sort of been running through this for the last 50 some years. And frankly, right now, I'm more interested in looking at the data that is different than I am about the comparative stuff, because it's maybe it's become a little dull to me. I don't know. We'll see about that. Maybe to start off, I'll tell you about maybe the classic work in comparing the flood traditions was a Mesopotamian scholar who was also a biblical scholar. In other words, he was Bible-believing Christian, Alexander Heidel. And so he got really good training. He was at the University of Chicago and was trained by the best Assyriologists. He wrote a book on the creation traditions, the Babylonian creation epic, and then this one, the Gilgamesh epic and Old Testament parallels. It came out right after World War II. Then he died soon after. I don't remember what happened. I don't know whether it was an accident or illness, but he died quite young, and so which was really a shame. But I want to read something about in his introduction. By the way, you can probably get this in a PDF file, both this and his creation epic story, though they are a little out of date now because so much has happened in the last 80 years. There's still, it's nice to know where we came from and where we got this information. And so, but in his preface, he has a sentence here I think will help you understand the spirit of the age. This is just after World War II. And he's, in his acknowledgments, he's acknowledging all the people who helped him out. And these are his Assyriology professors at University of Chicago. Then he says, the work of translating the more objectionable passages, this is in the Gilgamesh epic, into Latin has, for the most part, been done by a friend who prefers to remain anonymous. Thinking, what is he talking about? Well, the Gilgamesh epic, which I will briefly overview at some point in our podcast, either this time or the next time, has some sexually explicit material in it. And back in the 40s, Heidel, being quite modest, wanted to make sure that those passages are translated, but into Latin rather than English. However, the fellow who was the expert, fellow or lady, I don't know, the expert who did it in Latin, didn't want to be known as the translator, which I thought was, I suppose, just the spirit of the age. So anyway, so how do we get to this? What's the big deal about the flood stories? Maybe you got the memo. There are other flood traditions than the Bible. Spoiler alert, they are earlier than the biblical one. Even if you believe that Moses got this verbatim from God himself, and Moses at the earliest is 1400 BC, that's still at the very least a half a millennium later than the earliest evidence of a Mesopotamian flood tradition. So what do you do with that? My answer, and I'll sort of go from there, is that that's really no different than anything else we've talked about in these podcasts from the beginning, when the creation stories, the Mesopotamian creation stories, are earlier than the Mosaic account. So the fact that they're earlier doesn't mean that they're more correct just because they're earlier. That's sort of like the basic rule that any historian has, is just because there's an earlier account of something doesn't mean the earlier account is more correct than a later account. There's a whole host of reasons that there are many, many other things to look at when you're looking at historicity or reliability or veracity or, all these things, purpose, literary style, propaganda, evidence, etc. And so don't get wigged out about this. In fact, I even wrote a couple sentences about this. I brought this up before. This is my Mesopotamian the Bible, which I co-edited with Lawson Younger, and on page 28, I'm and this is in my article, Assyriology and Biblical Studies, where I'm trying to show, basically, I'm trying to give you sort of a summary of how the two fields have been sort of separated over the past century and how they it's been a problem in many respects. So on page 28, I write this. Arguably the most sensational find of the early periods was made when George Smith, who was an assistant in the British Museum, he had been studying Assyriology with the one of the great founding fathers, George Rawlinson. Smith, who had been enthralled with the Bible since he was a youth, was almost obsessed with knowing more about the historical books of the Old Testament. On 3 December 1872, Smith addressed the Society of Biblical Archaeology, which is a British group, and revealed a Babylonian account of the flood story. You have to remember, this is 1872. Nothing like this had ever been known. This was probably the most spectacular comparative find in all of Western history when it comes to the Bible. This is like, we're coming on, what will this be? I don't even look, 150 years since that happened or whatever. And causing an ecclesiastical and scientific sensation in both Britain and France, even greater than that of Laird's time. Laird was one of the excavators of Nineveh. And so this was even a bigger deal in many respects. Public interest in Mesopotamia was renewed. The flood texts were viewed by the public at the British Museum with great interest. Assyriology was now viewed as a sword to pierce the emerging German school of higher criticism, which was seen to be undermining the authority of the Bible. Smith was offered funding to find the missing portion of the tablet back in northern Iraq, which he did, by the way. Now we now know he originally had a tablet in the British Museum which came from the Gilgamesh epic, and it was from tablet 11, which talks about the flood. When he went back and actually found a fragment of a tablet among the ruins of the tablets that were still in the area of Nineveh, it was from what we call the Atrahasis epic, another version of the flood. Okay, but they didn't know that back then. But here was the problem. Although the Bible had priority as having the oldest records of humanity, this newfound deluge text clearly delineated a problem. How was there an earlier version of the holy text? Did it no longer have chronological priority? Smith refrained from providing his own interpretation. Okay, was this just a later perverted version from a different religious system or the origin of all flood stories? In retrospect, these issues ultimately caused the public to be wary of Assyriology, a discipline which was not regarded as being encumbered with the authority of Scripture. It was at this point that the two disciplines began to drift apart. And so, and that's certainly true, by the way. So I'm just going to keep that, have you keep that in mind as I try to answer this type of question, which I think I really have been doing podcast after podcast, is that the mere priority, chronologically speaking, of a text does not make it more authoritative just because it's older. There's too many other variables that go on. And just because I think a Mesopotamian text, is older doesn't, I suppose if that were the truth, I'd be a polytheist. Because the Mesopotamian texts, their view of, and I would also believe that the origin of that matter is eternal, and that non-personhood is where everything came from, non-material matter rather than a personal spiritual entity. And so, get over the fact that we have older versions of the flood. We have older versions of law codes. Just about everything else in Mesopotamia is older, but if you remember, the biblical writers admit that they come from their genealogical origins come from Mesopotamia. They're not looking for traditions to copy from. They're part of the same tradition. If you just keep that and anchor yourself in that, then you're not going to be intimidated by the fact that we've got some older material. Okay. All right. I got that. I feel better now that I get that off my chest. Okay. Now, one other thing about this George Smith guy, because by the way, he died soon after this. I think I read this before, but it was about 30 podcasts ago. So I think it's okay to copy myself. As a fledgling Mesopotamian student at UCLA in the mid 70s, I remember that there was a mimeographed copy of a piece of paper on the door of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and it said something like, contemplating a career in Assyriology, consider this. And this was what was written on the paper. It said, George Smith, an expert in ancient languages employed at the British Museum, made a discovery which shook the Victorian world. In translating a broken off section of one of the clay, it says books here, but it means tablets from Nineveh, he suddenly realized he was reading a partial story of the flood, written before the Hebrew version and interrupted by a break in the tablet. His discovery caused such a furor that the London Daily Telegraph backed him in an expedition to Mesopotamia, where he found the missing piece. And like I told you, it wasn't exactly the missing piece. The complete story of the flood almost exactly paralleled the biblical version, except for the names of the deity and of Noah, who was at Utnapishtim. But Smith's strenuous activities destroyed his mind and health. After making one especially difficult original translation of the British Museum, he exclaimed, quote, I am the first man to read this text after 2,000 years of oblivion, unquote. He then proceeded to remove his clothes in the presence of his startled colleagues. He died not long afterwards at the age of 36. Now, by the way, there is a time span in between those. He didn't die just because he took his clothes off. He did go and get terrible dysentery while he was overseas and kept on working and exerted himself and died. I think he was in Turkey, but en route back home, he died and left a young family. I think he was 36. And so, but of course, they strung these things together. So if you're thinking about being an Assyriologist, you're thinking, do I want to end up like this guy? I mean, is this what happens if you study Assyriology?
That would be my question. Is that what all you archaeologists do when you get a good find? Go streaking?
Well, there was actually streaking at Cal State Northridge when I was there, but that's another story. I found out that there wasn't as much streaking in Wisconsin, but I think it was weather related. So anyway, so my goal here now with this tongue-in-cheek introduction is to talk a little bit about the Mesopotamian flood traditions. They're haphazard and scattered. Probably, arguably, the earliest note about the flood assumes that you know all about it, by the way. And I think one of the there are possible allusions to the flood in some Sumerian traditions in the third millennium, but none of them are really airtight. But I think the earliest concrete one is in something called the Sumerian King List, which we really haven't brought up very much yet. This is a text that when it was translated by Jakobson in the late 1930s, they assumed it went back all the way to Utu-Hegel, which would be around 2115 BC. We now think that the earliest edition of the Sumerian King List is probably from the Isin-Larsa period, maybe the around 1950 BC. Not that 150 years really makes a big difference. It's written in Sumerian, and it says something like this. This actually comes from Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts. Oppenheim's the translator of this particular one. It says, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was first in Eridu. This, by the way, this ancient city, Eridu, is probably biblical Irad. And then it has a list of cities and kings. They're all ruling a tremendous amount. Usually it's, my guess right now is that most of the ages of the kings, they're in the thousands, but they're all based upon the 60. It looks like they're a sexagesimal system. By the way, that's the word for the day. If you're, ours is on a decimal system. You probably already knew that, by the way. But sexagesimal would be 60 rather than 10. Really be cool, except that it would be hard. You'd have to have, 60 different characters, I guess. That'd be a pain, rather than just, what do we have, 10? Yeah, okay. Well, actually 10 is, anyway, we have 10 different characters for numbers. I know you had to come on and listen to this podcast to find out how many characters we have in our numbers, and they're Arabic numbers. Anyway, the numbers are based upon a decimal, on 60. That might give me a hint as to what the numbers should be divided by 6, I think, or so, I don't know. Anyway, about halfway through it says, kingship was brought to Shuruppak, which, by the way, is the city of where the hero of the flood, or I should say anti-hero, because really you think of the hero of the flood, what does he do? He just gets into a tub and stays there for, some time, and then he gets out. What did you do while you were in there? Yeah, I guess you took care of animals and made sure that, everything runs, but you didn't exactly do anything. But kingship was brought to Shuruppak, and Shuruppak Ubar Tutu became king and ruled 18,600 years. And these are 5 cities, 8 kings who ruled for 240 plus thousand years. And then it says the flood swept over the earth. It doesn't give you any other commentary. And then it says after the flood swept over the earth, then kingship was lowered to this next city. It happens to be Kish, by the way. And then you just notice that the ages of each king is drastically lower, from like 1200 to 900 to 600. And it becomes, after about a couple generations, it becomes relatively normalized. This is not unlike the Genesis 5 genealogies, except that, Adam is paltry 900. Methuselah, 900 and, what is it, 960 or whatever. But that's nothing. It's like a snap of the fingers compared to this stuff. But the principle is the same, because after the flood, in biblical genealogies, the ages are drastically lowered until they get down, to an average. Okay, so that tradition is there. I think the biblical writers are well aware of these traditions, and they're responding to them. Okay, it doesn't mean that their traditions are inferior just because they're later. Just get over it. All right, sorry. Now, so that's probably the earliest mention of the flood tradition, but it's assumed that you know all about it. In fact, there's really only one other Sumerian text that talks about the flood tradition, and it's clearly the flood. I'm not even sure it's the earliest one, but I just want to bring it up. It's the Sumerian evidence of the flood. It's probably an old Babylonian copy, which would mean, circa 1700 BC. So whenever it is, it's at least 300-400 years before Moses, probably more than that. And it's a fragment. It was originally, I think the earliest publication was by Pebble, right around the beginning of World War I in German, so a harder language than Sumerian, by the way. Tongue-in-cheek, I said that. And it was then, I don't know whether the earliest, it was mentioned by L.W. King around 1910, but I think that one of the earliest publications in English was by Samuel Noah Kramer, who was really, we have a lot to thank Kramer for, because even though he made perhaps lots of mistakes in his Sumerian translations based upon later editions, he brought it to a really interested public, and his history begins at Sumer and other little paperback books that came out when I was a young guy. We ate these books up, because this is like, wow, we have all these fun translations. Well, Kramer happens to bring up the Sumerian version of the deluge. And by the way, when this was found, we already knew about the Akkadian versions for at least 40 years before this. And so this is nothing new. And Miguel Seville has made the comment that this Sumerian text is written down by scribes who are probably not speaking Sumerian any longer. In other words, Sumerian is probably a dead language. the Sumerian text is possibly, and by the way, I'm going to rely on Seville. I cannot. He was like the smartest Assyriologist in the world for the past 50 years, and so I can't evaluate this, and there's no, I can't argue with it. But he implies that the Sumerian version of the flood that we have probably comes from an Akkadian version. So it's not, so in other words, we really don't have any original Sumerian text. We have nothing from the third millennium. It doesn't mean that there isn't a tradition that comes from Sumer. It just means that we don't have it. And Assyriologists, basically, if you don't have a text, I'll say it in the vernacular, you either put up or shut up. In other words, if you don't have it, don't talk about it. There's no Q version of Mark or, in the Gospels or whatever. Don't theorize about something that isn't there. And so you would get shot down so quickly at a conference if you talked about a theoretical text. And so anyway.
So he's saying that, so this is in Sumerian, but he's saying it's translated from the Akkadian.
Possibly a translation from an earlier Akkadian text. And again,
how does
it's theory.
Just curious mind. What leads him to believe?
Because the Sumerian grammar isn't normative, and it's a little wooden, and it's written by somebody who, like I said, look this way. If you learn Latin, you wouldn't start writing Latin vernacular and regular speech because nobody speaks Latin anymore. In other words, it's a dead language. And so you're learning a fixed text. There are no new words in Latin. There's no new slang in Latin, etc., unless you decide to start speaking Latin. In English, we already talked about this, even with the word Nimrod. You said you were called a Nimrod when you were a kid. Well, that couldn't have happened when I was a kid. In other words, it wasn't a slang word. We're always finding, new words or using old words in new ways because English is still a viable language. It's changing dramatically. That's why somebody who speaks British English and American English can interact with each other, but they can make fun of each other because their use of words has changed. And in subtle ways that, I can still understand you, but why would you use that word that way? Or Sumerian's frozen at this point. There's nothing new happening. And so he's guessing, but he doesn't have any concrete proof about it. And I probably shouldn't have brought it up to begin with. But
no, it's okay. I was just curious.
Anyway, yes, I knew you were. But thank you for your support. So anyway, the Sumerian text is fragmented, but it's really important because it's got a few lines. The first 40 lines of the text are gone. And by the way, think about it. How does that happen? Well, if you have a clay tablet, it's kind of like a piece of paper here. If I think about it, if I want to give you this text, but I'm thinking, well, I'm going to give you this text, Keegan, but I'm going to rip off the first top here, and so you don't even know what it's about. I'm going to give you the middle, and I'm going to take the top and the bottom, and I give it to you. Oh, by the way, I'm going to also rip the sides off here too. And so you just have a little box in the middle. Now figure out what the story is. Now, let's say it's the Declaration of Independence, but you've really studied a lot. You can look at it and say, I wonder if this is the Declaration of Independence. And I said, you're right. You got it. How long did it take you? Well, I had to stay up till 2 a.m. to figure it out. So how do I know this is the deluge story? Because the first 40 lines are missing or thereabouts. And then afterwards it starts talking about the fact that Nintu is who's one of the nicknames of the creation goddess in Mesopotamia. And it says, after Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Nehursau had fashioned the black-headed people, which, by the way, for some reason, the Sumerians call themselves the black-headed people, not the black-haired people, but the black-headed people. We don't know what the term signifies. We still don't. There's lots of guesses, but nobody knows. It says after kingship had been lowered, etc., and all this was going on, the first cities were founded. So it's talking about something that sounds like the kingless. Then it says, the gods of heaven uttered the name of Enlil and Enlil, and then Ziusudra, the king, built a giant something. We don't know what it is, and he brought forth all kinds of dreams, uttering something. He standeth by the side of this thing, and then somebody's talking to him, but it's not talking to him; it's talking to a wall, which, by the way, happens in the Gilgamesh epic when Enki's. He doesn't want to get caught by the other gods that he's talking directly to a human, so he starts talking to a wall or a boat or something. And so here it says, stand by the wall at my left side. By the wall, I'm going to give you a word. Give ear to my instruction. By our something, a flood, broken over the cult centers to destroy the seed of mankind, is the decision, the word of the assembly of the gods. By the way, if this sounds fragmented, it's because it is. And then there's going to be windstorms. That's right. 40 more lines are destroyed. Then it starts up again. Windstorms exceedingly powerful. At the same time, the floods will sweep over the cult centers. And for 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. A huge boat had been tossed about by windstorms. Utu came forth, that's the sun god, who sheds light on heaven. Ziusudra opened up a window. The hero Utu brought his rays into the giant boat. Ziusudra, the king, prostrated himself before Utu. And Ziusudra, by the way, the king, happens to be he who sought life. He's the hero of the flood story.
What's his name?
Ziusudra. Okay. That's the Sumerian flood guy. Is this the earliest account? I don't know, but it's the Sumerian one. Okay. And it's very fragmented. If this is all I had, it's like, wow, that's pretty underwhelming, but it does sort of kind of sound like there's a big flood going on. So what do we do with this?
Who is this Utu character?
Utu is the sun god.
Sun god.
That's the name. And in Akkadian, Utu's name is Shamash, which is still the word for sun. And even today in Arabic, my workers talk about the Shems being really hot. It's the same root. It's the sun god, and it's also the word, for the sun itself. All right. So, that's pretty cool. You got this, you got the Sumerian version. It's the version was found amongst texts that are now in Pennsylvania. So they probably came from the American expedition at Nippur, which was the great holy city in Mesopotamia. That means they were probably uncovered in the 1890s and published by Pebble right around 1914. He probably couldn't do a whole lot else because, of course, something happened in World War, that's right, World War I. Although I think they didn't call it World War I back then. They called it the Great War. I don't know why they didn't know. But anyway, so there are isolated fragments. It's, like I said, it's not earlier than late Old Babylonian, so it's maybe 1700 BC. And so we have this text. Great. Okay. We also have other fragments. I thought I would bring these up before there's also something that was that a fellow brought to, and by the way, if you're looking for somebody if you think all Assyriologists are dry, like me, and are boring and are like just should be buried in a library, well, then this is your man, Irving Finkel, who's got a beard down to his knees, white, long bushy hair. He's a little older than I am too, so he's definitely my elder. But just YouTube this guy and listen to one of his lectures, and you will be so amused and entertained. He's also really smart, and he's like the keeper of the 130,000+ tablets of the British Museum to this day. But this cool book, The Ark Before Noah, he's been going public lately. I talked about him recently. Well, actually, in a podcast that hasn't aired yet, about his book on ghosts. But this is his book on the Ark Before Noah, because one day when he was sort of sitting in his little cubbyhole at the British Museum, a guy came up and had a tablet for him to look at that was in his family's possession. It happened to be what is now called the Ark tablet, because it's a fragment of a text that was published by Finkel in just a decade ago. And it's kind of cool because it's written in Akkadian. It's probably either late Old Babylonian or early Middle Babylonian. I know you're thinking, well, what's the difference? Maybe 100 or 200 years, but we're around 1600 BC, etc. But here's a fragment of a text that talks about the boat that is in the Mesopotamian flood traditions, because there's a number of them. Just like and when we talked about the creation stories, there's multiple creation stories coming out of Mesopotamia, but they do have a common denominator amongst them. There's some common denominators here. And so here's a fragment of text. I'm going to read actually out of, not out of Irving Finkel's text, but Nathan Wasserman's The Flood Akkadian Sources. This is the newest edition of this stuff. Came out, I think, around 2020. It's really scholarly and really pointy-headed in terms of detailed. So, but you could probably get this on a PDF file. Don't tell anybody. If you simply Google Wasserman, The Flood Akkadian Sources, you can get the whole thing. This is actually a library copy because I can't afford this thing myself. It's way too much money. But Wasserman's text, I'm on page 68. I'm going to just read a couple of the text. Here is an unnamed god, because the text is broken. By the way, that's always the fallback. If you're an Assyriologist, if you're getting nervous and say, I'm really not sure what's going on here, say, oh, the text is broken here. Let's move on, especially if you're sweating, or if you're at a conference and so the text is broken there. I don't know what happened. It says wall, reed fence. So in other words, a god's talking to an inanimate object, and he's hoping that the inanimate object will talk to the flood hero. Atrahasis, that's the Akkadian name for the flood, literally exceedingly wise. Pay attention to my advice so that you'll live forever. Leave your house, build a boat, spurn property, and keep your life intact. The boat which you'll build, let me tell you how to build it. It's going to be circular. By the way, he's actually building something that is called by the British, but also in the Middle East, the British name is coracle. I had to look it up, by the way. And by the way, Finkel actually had a documentary about this, and so it's pretty cool. They actually reproduced one of these things. It's round, woven, wooden frame, and so look up his documentary. I think it's around the same time this book came out. Length and breadth should be equal. Her base should be 1 eco, her hull should be 1 nindano high, etc. I'm not going to, but it's a big circular boat. And so it's there kind of like the little, rubber ducky that you put in your bathtub, probably your kid's bathtub. I'm sorry.
The one you still.
I don't know whether you use it when they're not in there, but the point is that Irving Finkel thought this was the coolest thing since sliced bread, by the way. He's describing all this and stuff. And so his argument was, well, see, Noah's boat is all wrong. It doesn't make sense. This is more seaworthy, and it's just like what the marsh dwellers in Mesopotamia used to this day. And so why wouldn't they use that, in the time of the Babylonian Noah? And so it describes in detail the size of the boat. Enlil got upset about it. It talks about all the wild animals from the steppe that went in there 2 by 2, by the way. And all these plants were brought in, etc. That's so the animals could eat, I guess. And it says caulk the frame of the door, and after 60 lines, it's ended. In other words, it's broken. But you've got this fragment, and it looks as if it's from another tradition that's not one of the other flood traditions. And you're thinking, all right, so why are you bringing all this up? Just to be complete.
So remind me again, what was the hero in that one?
Atrahasis.
Atrahasis.
So you got Ziusudra is the Sumerian name, which means something like long of life. Atrahasis is emphasizing his wisdom. He's exceedingly wise. And then before I get to the two main ones, I'm going to talk about a guy that we've brought up a couple times before. His name's Berossus. He's a Mesopotamian scholar living in the time of Alexander, the Hellenistic period. It's after Alexander, but he's a 3rd century Babylonian writer who's writing basically a history and culture of his people in Greek, probably to a Greek audience. He is clearly a Babylonian scribe. And by the way, they still got cuneiform at this point. Cuneiform still being written. The latest cuneiform text that we have is from the late 1st century AD, by the way. And so he's probably a Babylonian scribe of Bel, which would be Marduk. And I talked about him. I've talked about him actually
a few episodes
pretty often, but he actually talks about the flood. And since we've always had this, it shouldn't have been so shocking to us to find out that there were Mesopotamian editions of the flood, because Berossus talks about it. Okay. And remember, Berossus' work didn't survive, but it survived in Josephus and other classical writers and early church writers describe it. And one of my teachers at UCLA, Stanley Burstein, he was a visiting professor, brought up Berossus' account. So I'm going to look at Stanley's account of Berossus, just to tell you that we've always, from classical times throughout the entire early church period, we've known that there were other versions of the flood that were potentially earlier than Moses. Okay. But we just didn't want to admit it. I think it was too painful to admit, because, we had this preconceived idea that the Holy Writ was basically, given by God verbatim to Moses and all the prophets, and it was something that was a heavenly document that came down, rather than admit the possibility that God actually spoke to real people in a real environment, in their own context, in their own language, when their own similes and metaphors and parables and context. That was it was too difficult and too painful to understand that. And that's what I've been doing for the past 50 years, is trying to figure all this stuff out. So if this seems like a shock to your system, I would say stop the podcast and go listen to earlier podcasts where I try to develop these themes. If you're starting here, it's going to be a shock. Yeah, it's going to be a shock to your system. So here's Berossus in Burstein's work. This Berossus, he might have a Sumerian account that he's looking at, because he says, after the death of this king, his son Ziusudra, which must be the Grekified version of Ziusudra, reigned for 18 something. By the way, probably 1860s. In other words, that's we would say decades, but this is the 60s. Altogether, there were 10 kings, blah, blah, blah. In his time, it says the great flood occurred, and the story has been recorded as follows. And now he starts describing the flood. It says, Kronos appeared to Ziusudra. Now, Kronos would be the Greek version of, probably Enki or Ea, I guess. And Kronos, of course, is a Greek god. But even the Greeks understood that whenever there is in other words, if the Babylonians have a god of a sun, the sun god, then that's the same counterpart that we have for our sun god, Helios or whatever. In other words, they recognize the connections here. And so he appeared to Ziusudra in a dream and revealed that on the 15th day of the month, mankind would be destroyed by a flood. No reason given, by the way. So he ordered Mr. X to bury the beginnings and the middles and the ends of all writings in Sippar, the city of the sun. Then he should build a boat. He had to load on it all the winged and four-footed creatures. How do you load the winged creatures in there? Anyway, to make everything ready to sail. If asked where he was sailing, just say, to the gods to pray for everybody. In other words, lie. Heating them, he built a boat 5 stays in length, 2 stays in breadth. He collected everything he had been ordered. He went on. On the 3rd day after the flood had come, He released some birds. That sounds familiar. To determine whether they would somewhere land and risen by the waters. By finding neither food nor a place to which to alight, the birds returned to the ship. He released more birds later on to the ship, but with their feet covered with mud. Then on the third time he released some more birds, they didn't return. This sounds really familiar. He understood that land had reappeared, tearing apart a portion of the seams, and seeing that the boat had landed on a mountain, he disembarked with his wife and his daughter and the pilot. After performing obeisance on the earth, he did an altar. He sacrificed to the gods, he and those who had disembarked. And then because of his piety, he had gone to live with the gods. He and his wife and the pilot were to share the same honor. And that went on. After this, they sacrificed the god, and they proceeded to Babylon on foot, which now was rebuilt. And of course, that's where all the other guys come in. So this has always been there. And I think that one argument that could have been made that was sort of wishful thinking was, well, he was probably just copying from the biblical story because it's later anyway. And thinking, no, that's not what's going on. Berossus is getting this from the Babylonian text, but they didn't have him yet. Well, now we have him. We've had him since 1872 on 3 December. And they're just older. Okay, so what do you do with that? That's the, that's the question I have. Now we want to go into the next two, unless you have a thought or question before move on. And maybe I can briefly summarize what the two big ones are, and then we'll see where we can go from there. So first, maybe the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic is probably the most famous epic that comes out of Mesopotamia. There are a significant amount of versions of the Gilgamesh epic. By the way, the Gilgamesh epic really should be called the Gilgamesh epics. It is probably a series of 12 tablets, and in 12 tablets in many respects, it's actually not unlike the book of Daniel. If you think about it, the book of Daniel has 12 chapters because it was pretty easy to make them into chapters, and each chapter seems to have an individual story that really isn't dependent upon the previous story. They're pretty much 12 standalone stories, or at least the first 8 or 9 chapters are pretty much that way. Is that, in other words, it's almost as if you have about 8 or 9, 12 separate Daniel traditions that have been woven together and put together by a Daniel scribe. Whether that was, I know you're going to argue that was Daniel. Great. My answer is that there's a lot of early stuff in Daniel and there's a lot of later stuff in Daniel. So what does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that in authorship. I know I keep on saying that, but I've been building up.
You're just buying time.
That's exactly what I'm doing.
And then what's going to happen is you're going to introduce it and say, "Oh, Keegan twisted my arm again," even though you so desperately want to talk about authorship.
Well, yes, but I'm doing that for effect because I want to put, because if it doesn't go well, we're going to put the blame on Keegan. If it goes well, then see, I did it all along. Sorry, Keegan.
I'll take it.
Yes. All right. Good.
At least I can do one thing on this.
So anyway, because it might be the last podcast when I talk about authorship. That's all I'm going to say. But I really, I hope that we'll go further. Anyway, so the Gilgamesh traditions it's the most famous epic in all of Mesopotamia. Is the earliest edition that is a somewhat unified weaving of the traditions, is from the Old Babylonian period, where we have this flurry of scholarship and copyists that they're copying all the great traditions. And the Gilgamesh story is about this great hero Gilgamesh, who probably was a real person, living in his city is the city of Uruk. He's probably a Sumerian king, living early 3rd millennium, maybe 2700 BC. If he's a real person, there's lots of traditions about him, which of course are superhuman. He's a semi-divine being, and of course he's been compared to the Nephilim, and I did that way back in our Nephilim podcast, which I'm going to have to bring up again, by the way, not today, but pretty soon. But anyway, the Gilgamesh tradition I compare to the tradition about Achilles, and let's say Hercules in Greek traditions, who both perhaps might have been real historical personages whose stories have been embellished, to create, these superhuman characters. And like Achilles, Gilgamesh seems to be a spoiled brat who bothers people. He goes off on great adventures. He learns from his experiences, and then he actually ends up having real empathy for people. I'm not going to spoil the whole story, but as he's going off looking for immortality, and by the way, for him, immortality is by making himself a great name, and doing great deeds that mean that his name will last forever. Even if he doesn't, he happens to run across the hero of the flood, whose name, by the way, in this tradition is Utnapishtim. He who saw long life, was probably maybe the Akkadian counterpart of the Ziusudra guy. And so this is in Tablet 11. It doesn't really fit the Gilgamesh traditions very well because it's sort of out of place. In other words, it's like a long bunny trail in the middle of the story. You like that, huh?
Like our podcast.
Yes, exactly. And what is interesting about it is that in the old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, we do not have the flood epic yet. In other words, that tablet is missing. It's not there, if it ever was. And so the Gilgamesh account of the flood actually is quite late. It's from the Neo-Assyrian period, from the tablets of Nineveh. And so when George Smith found the flood tablet, it was actually from something that probably was at least written down in the maybe 8th, but probably 7th century BC. And so it was actually chronologically, well, ironically speaking, it was later than the Mosaic account, if you think the Mosaic account was Moses. Okay, that's another story that we're not going to muddy up right here. And by the way, if you're confused, I've had to live with this confusion for 50 years, and so I really don't mind if you're a little confused.
So is there any argument then? Is it like or what is your view on that? Is it like an editorial addition, or we're just missing the earlier ones?
I don't know. We're just missing it, but but here it is. We have a lot of independent Gilgamesh traditions. In fact, there are about 12 Sumerian Gilgamesh traditions from either the old Babylonian period or earlier in Sumerian about Gilgamesh. Half of them made it into the famous Gilgamesh epic. Half of them are standalones that were not brought in. In other words, it's like, I've got all these cool Gilgamesh stories. I'm going to pull 6 of these and make them into my traditions. And the other ones are out there. They're really interesting, but they didn't fit. In other words, I wove together to create this new story about Gilgamesh. It's kind of like my made-for-TV movie. In other words, I got all these Gilgamesh traditions. Some of them I pulled in, some of them I didn't. And I also attached the flood story to it, but that's only in the later edition of the story.
Right. So that's
now, just to make matters worse, is that they're all heavily fragmented. So we have the Pennsylvania tablet from Nippur, which from the old Babylonian period, which has evidences of the flood story, and it has to be filled in by the Neo-Assyrian version, which is an entire millennium later. And so you have to have both of them to piece together fragments to try to create a composite. But even when you do that, you can see where there's been differences. And then, like I said, the flood story is from the later edition. Does that help you?
The current, like the full flood stories from the later, or are
the Gilgamesh flood story
as a whole? It
is from the Neo-Assyrian period, which is,
we don't even have fragments from earlier, whatever.
No, not of the Gilgamesh story. We do have from another one, but not from the Gilgamesh story. I know.
Does the fragment we do have, does that match the Gilgamesh flood, as in terms of like maybe it's one of those outliers that didn't make it into the earlier version? Is that
It's
what's assumed?
definitely talking about the flood story, but it's a different edition. That's all I can say. It's not. It's clearly a different edition, and we'll hopefully I'll iron some of this out when I start talking about the
Because
stories.
again, and then because people are going to be like, what is he talking about? So in my mind, I'm just asking from
Good.
the standpoint of, so if they have these fragmented pieces that some of them we don't collect, and then it gets brought in the later version, then it's either is the flood story within the Epic of Gilgamesh a later, which not saying it couldn't have been tradition then, but it's an editorial edition later, or was it one of the fragmented ones that we didn't bring in and then we brought it in later? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I wish I can give you a yes or no answer.
I figured you'd say
Right
this.
now, the evidence is that the Gilgamesh flood is only known from a later text. Okay, is there an earlier edition? Right now, no. In other words, is there an earlier Gilgamesh edition of the flood? No, right now there isn't. However, there are other earlier editions of the flood story. They're clearly different. When I say different, they're just different. It's clearly talking about the same thing. It'd be like you and I telling the story, a story about the same event.
Yeah, but different in terms of completely different, like the first two fragments we looked at, or a different version of the same Gilgamesh.
Oh no,
story.
it's completely different. It
has nothing to do with the Gilgamesh
It has
epic.
nothing to do with the Gilgamesh epic at all.
So like what we talked about before.
Okay,
Or like the Greek, because that's
yes.
Okay. Anywho, now that I'm
but I want to
confused.
keep talking about Gilgamesh for just a minute. The Gilgamesh epic is so incredibly famous is that, we have editions of Gilgamesh that continue on. We have them at Ugarit on the coast of Syria, which is late bronze, 1200 BC. We have them in Hittite Anatolia about the same time period. We even have a fragment of the Gilgamesh epic at Megiddo in northern Israel / Palestine. I know you're going to be upset if I use both terms. I'm just going to, geographically speaking, Megiddo is like a northern outpost it's the northernmost outpost of cuneiform literature. It doesn't seem to have really come south, or at least there seemed to have been a vacuum in the south, and then it proceeds into Egypt in some places where there's a scribal tradition. But there's a fragment of the flood. There's even a fragment of a Hammurabi law at Megiddo. So there's a scribe there learning his ABCs, and when I took my graduate writing exam in Akkadian, which was a terrifying thing because there was a portion of it where you could use helps. In other words, I could use the Assyrian dictionary if I ran into trouble with a text. And then there was another text where I had to sight read a tablet or a hand copy of a tablet. And so everybody was terrified, but what am I going to be given? So I'm sitting down there in the room thinking, this is going to make or break my life. Like, can I translate this thing or not? And you had no idea what you were going to get. You're just going to get something, and it could have been something you had seen before. It could have been something you had never seen in your life. And I start looking at it, and I'm thinking, what is this? And all of a sudden, I start looking at it, and the first line came up, and it was about the gods. It was about the Anunnaki, and it was about the flood. I'm thinking, it's the flood story. I'm saved. I know this. I know this background. I know what's going to happen. I know the flood story in English. That means I can do it in Akkadian, and I did it. I don't know if I did it well, but I did it enough well to pass. And so I was so thankful. And so whenever I think of the flood story, it's like, wow, this just brings back warm fuzzy memories about my reading exam in Akkadian. Maybe not that fuzzy, but anyway. So the other account, so the flood story, by the way, in Gilgamesh is in one tablet. It's short, and I will be talking about it in more detail a little bit later because I want to look at how the gods present themselves in there and their response to the actual flood itself. It's just going to be a little surprising, but there is a much fuller version. It wasn't known until a little bit later in the early 20th century. And this is this is the story of Atrahasis, and so this is the version of the flood. The fullest version that we have from Mesopotamia is the version that we call Atrahasis. This was done 50 years ago, but it really, I think for a popular audience, this is probably the best book to get. Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, Lambert and Millard. I got to know both of them, but I got to know Millard really well. He was a Bible-believing Christian who sort of took me under his wing once at a conference and sort of showed me how not to do things, basically. So this came out in, I think, in the late 60s, and it really has stood the test of time. Here we are 50-some years later, and so Wasserman basically republished these texts and with new ones, and in fact, he even applauds them like, man, this thing has stood the test of time. So I want to say a few words about the Atrahasis epic, and probably we'll be done with this podcast here today, is that this is an old Babylonian, This is an old Babylonian version of the flood, circa 1700, so it's what you might call late Old Babylonian. This is after Hammurabi, by the way, if you're wondering. There are Neo-Assyrian versions of this text, which are important because they help fill in the breaks that we have for it. From the Library of Honor Ashurbanipal, there's actually an author / editor / compiler / maybe what you might call weaver to this text. His name is, Nur Aya, from the reign of Ammisaduqa. So this is 1700, maybe a little bit later. He calls himself the arranger. And by the way, this is going to be my hint about authorship. He's saying, I'm not the author, but I'm the guy who put all this stuff together and basically I'm in a new creation. How much of it is mine? Well, I'm not telling you. Okay. And I really think this is how authorship existed in the ancient Near East and in the Bible, by the way. This is why there's so little emphasis on authorship in the Old Testament, and which bothers us terribly. And I think it shouldn't. And so we have this version, and it actually does give a reason for the flood itself. The gods are upset with humans because there's too dang many of them. And evidently, not only are there too many of them, there's no way to stop it. In other words, there's no such thing as death yet. So people are procreating and they're just filling the earth and it's noisy, and the gods, they really hadn't thought this out, evidently. And so they're just really upset with it. So when I start talking, because in the next podcast, what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start talking about the Atrahasis epic as a composite, and then I'm going to talk about the Gilgamesh epic, but not so much to compare it to the Bible, but to show you that their purposes are so different and so at odds with the biblical text. It is that the biblical writer, can you imagine if I had the biblical compiler next to me and I said, your epic sounds just like the Babylonian ones, I think the writer would probably say something like, maybe in Yiddish, "Oy vey, did you actually read the text? The whole point is that I'm nothing like them. My version is so different because the God behind my version is so different than these other gods. Didn't you get that?" And I have to say, oh, so that's your purpose. Your purpose isn't to, in other words, I agree with some of the details, but the meaning behind the details is what's different. So I'm actually going to piggyback off of what I consider a really, really smart work that came out, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I always, if it's recent, I forget all of the dates. So this came out in, was it 22? Come on, Adam. 2023. Adam Migio, who's at Wheaton College, a Christian, the Gilgamesh epic in Genesis 1 through 11, and then his subtitle, really cool, peering into the deep. This guy's a really smart guy. I've had a little bit of correspondence with him a really long time ago. He's an expert on Mari. So I want to talk a lot more to him. But he must be one of those guys that had a life outside of Assyriology. He got his degree at University of Chicago, but he really seems to be into like literary criticism. And if you add literary criticism to Assyriology and biblical studies, it makes you really dangerous, I think. And so I just sort of lapped up this book like, wow, he's got so many insights. I never even thought of this before. And so I'm going to sort of piggyback off of a chapter he wrote on the flood. Okay. And his argument is then we look at the purpose of the flood in the Atrahasis story. And then I'm going to look at the purpose of the flood in the Gilgamesh story. Then I'm going to look at the purpose of the flood in the biblical story. And for me, I'm going to concentrate in the biblical story on the issue of God repenting. What does it mean for God to repent of something? Because, of course, if you think about it in human terms, it's like if I repent, it's maybe a twofold thing. If I did something evil, I repent means that was evil. I better stop doing that. And so I'm going to turn from that. I'm going to stop doing it. Or I could repent from something like, it didn't occur to me that if I, did this, this would happen. So now that I have this new information, I realize that was something I shouldn't have done. So I'm going to repent from that. In other words, new information came in and I just processed that information. So now I'm going to find out that I'm not going to do that anymore. Maybe I drove a car without a seatbelt and I got into an accident and I got hurt. And I said, oh, new information. I should wear a seatbelt from now on. That was brilliant. I just thought it up. So in other words, when God repents, does that mean that God got new information? And so it's like, I got new information. No, I don't think so. So what does it mean for God to repent? And I'm going to get theological on you. By the way, it's going to hurt a little bit to do it, but I'm going to try to do that. That'll probably podcast or two afterwards. But the whole point is that the biblical story is written in response to the traditions that are, in a sense, ancient Near Eastern and given. And remember, think about it. Let's just say again, this is Moses writing to an audience that is a bunch of slaves in Egypt. Remember, they're ancient Near Eastern. They're probably theologically pretty pagan. They just learned about the God that saved them. They probably aren't full-blown monotheists yet. And so what is Moses doing, or the writers? They're basically saying, all right, you've got this received tradition about creation. Let me tell you the real story. You've got this received tradition about, let's say, patriarchs and genealogies. You got a received tradition about Babel. You got a received tradition about Nimrod or whatever. You got received tradition about all these things. Now so these are received traditions. They're wrong. They're pagan. We need to reframe them in the correct manner in the framework of monotheism. If we do that with everything else, why can't we do that with the flood traditions? That's my argument.
So like what we've talked in the past of a theological message or a theological response
Absolutely.
to it. Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean it's the only reason that we have a flood story. In other words, the flood story in the Bible can stand alone. It does not need it. The only reason is not simply to respond to Mesopotamia. But it is one of the reasons. That's how I look at it. It's not an either or proposition. Hardly anything is, really. And so please don't misunderstand me. The flood story in Genesis, in its final edited edition, which I believe is probably late Babylonian, in response to the exile, in its final edition, it is responding to the traditions that they're very aware of in the exile. It doesn't mean that their editions are all late. They have early editions that they could go back to Abraham or earlier, as far as I know. but they are now responding to the additions that everyone knows about in their culture, and now they're giving us, I suppose, in the same way that, if if we're politically conservative and liberal or whatever, we're going to have very different ways of perceiving our American past. And so, if you're a professor who's very liberal and you have very distinct views as to about the founding fathers, and I'm going to come back and you say, wait a minute, no, I've got a very conservative view. I've got a different take on how this, and that happened. And perhaps the answer is in between, although the biblical writers are going to tell you, no, we have a notion that there's a single, transcendent, divine spiritual being that made everything out of this, and everything emanates from him. And so this is how we look at all of the traditions that are received. And so we're not arguing against the received we're not arguing against the existence of the received tradition. We're arguing against how it's been appropriated by and perverted by pagan polytheism. So the next podcast, I'm going to start looking at the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epics when it talks about the flood, looking at the divine purpose behind them and response to them, and then compare that to the biblical one. And like I said, this is going to be my guide. Adam will be my guide in trying to do this.
So there you go. There's your warning. Get read up on.
Yep.
that.
Yep. You can get this on a PDF, by the way, if you work hard. By the way, although I just actually got this in the mail. I got it pretty cheap, Amazon. Yeah. And by the way, I think there was one copy left that's cheap. So if you can't find a cheap copy, you can blame me. I got it.
There you go.
But used copy.
Well, perfect. Yeah, no, I do have questions, but I think the questions are going to still pertain to what we're going to talk about in the future. So I think this is a good place to stop, and a good first entrance into the topic of the flood. So
Here.
all right, there you have it. Well, this was a good introduction to the flood series that we're doing. Hope you enjoyed this. If you do have questions, I know I didn't ask a lot on this one. I'm sure everybody's like, thank gosh.
I'll try not to water things down. I'm sorry.
It's still bad. But feel free, drop some comments. We got our email attached below. As always, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Until next time, when we continue our topic on the flood, we hope you all have a wonderful week. Get read up, order that, or find the PDF. And we'll see you next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.